Compiler should, if an inline is a command rather than a hint, the compiler should throw an error if it is impossible to comply. That's probably maybe true. I just don't want to decree something that hard line until we try it because, you know, there might be some case in which things get weird. We'll see. Yeah. I think you have to just try building large programs before you can say that. But it's likely. It's likely that there would at least be a warning issued if it can't inline. The thing is that whether some things are inline or not doesn't specifically affect your program's semantics usually, unless you need a symbol to be there or not be there. So yeah, we'll see. Can you selectively uninitialize some members of a struct? For example, make a vector 3 but leave x uninitialized. Yes, you can. So I'll go do that. Right. So let's go back to which part was it? Part 3. So here we're going to have a 1 by uninitialized by 9 vector 3 in just this explicit default value. So I'm really screwing with it. So you can see it happened to come out to 0 this time. But yes, you can do that. Any combination that you want, you can make happen. When squaring the value of p in the static array, you mentioned that the syntax was slightly confusing. You also mentioned in an earlier demo that using 2 single quotes for character literals was something of a syntactic waste. What about using a single quote to dereference a pointer? Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't want to get into too many discussions about syntax yet. It's hard to say why. Like, on the one hand, syntax is important, and I spent a significant amount of time in the first 2 talks before there was even an implementation of the language, talking about how important syntax is to the joy of programming and the ability to get stuff done and readability and all that. However, the problem with syntax is it's really easy to talk about syntax, and everybody has an opinion about syntax, and that's fine, that's as it should be, but it can drown out talking about other deeper issues. So I really don't want to get into bike shedding about syntax all the time, so I'm going to discourage us to discuss it for now. Like way later, once the language is mostly solidified in terms of semantics, then we can talk about syntax and try to figure out the syntax that's absolutely the best. But for now, I'm actually not going to worry about it. Like this, is that good? I don't know. Is the caret good? Is it too hard to type? I don't know. I don't care that much. Right? So I'm just trying to do approximations to a reasonable syntax without getting all the way there. Do I think it would be a good idea to force type initialization with : equals to avoid bugs about assuming a type has a certain default value? I don't think I understand the question because no, I don't think that would be good, because I mean default values are always 0, first of all. Like you don't assume that anything has a certain default value. Like the default value for that is the 0 value of your type. So there's not really confusion. I don't know. I mean, we'll see. Maybe I'm not understanding something that will happen as programs get big, and we'll see if that becomes an issue, but I don't think there will be. What happens if you try to use an array element in the loop after it's removed? Well, by default, you're iterating by value, so it doesn't matter what's in the array because you have a local value. So even if it's a big thing like a vector 3, you would end up with a local vector 3 copy. Now, hopefully, in cases where you don't remove or you don't use after removal and you don't try to modify, then the compiler could elide that copy anyway. Like it's a very restricted situation in which I would hope that would happen. But by default, with an unoptimizing compiler, you'd be copying the element out of the array anyway. So if you use that, then that's fine. Now, if you're iterating by pointer, right, then that becomes a problem because you have a pointer to the inside of the array, right? So if you remove the element, then you're pointing to the wrong element now. Here's the thing, is that because remove is explicitly it's explicit syntax, and the compiler knows what that is, the compiler probably could check effectively for use after removal in those kinds of cases and give you an error or a warning or something. I don't, I didn't want to implement that yet because I haven't needed it, and I'm not sure if there's any kinds of snafus that would make that more difficult, but I think it should be kind of straightforward, actually. But right now, I want to focus more on language functionality than, to the extent that I put in error checking, I want them to be checking for very common errors. That'll help most people. Someone's saying they usually think of array as being ordered, which means it's weird to have unordered remove. Have I considered adding both array and set, where one cares about order and one doesn't? Not really. I don't ever feel the need to have that reinforced at a type level when I program. I do, on rare occasions, want to have arrays that are ordered, and I want to know that they're ordered. But usually I'll do that in the name, or I'll just comment that it has to be ordered or something. And adherence of extreme strong typing would tell you no, like every single difference like that should be determined in the type, because that'll help prevent compile time errors. And it may help prevent compile time errors, but it may also increase friction. Because that's never a problem that I personally had, I don't see the need for it, and so I don't necessarily want to do it. If there's a lot of complaints later, we'll consider something, right? Like, either the ordered remove keyword or an ordered version of an array. I don't know. It feels to me right now like the good things to do are very small abstractions over what the computer is doing, right? And if you say something is an ordered array, does that mean you're keeping it sorted when people insert or something? At which case, that really sounds like something that should be in the standard library and not in the language to me. But again, that's just my provisional answer for now. How about inlining C, C++ code snippets? No. If you want to call out to C, a different compiler will compile that C. Well, I mean, never say never. Like, C is a simple enough language if you get rid of some of the crazy new stuff that's in C. C is a simple enough language that if you were to take just like C99, did minus trigraphs, did C99 have trigraphs? I don't know. You could do most of that, and it wouldn't be that big of a job, probably. So in the far future, like if people are actually using this language a lot, and it's like, I want you to be able to compile C directly and link to it directly, we could consider that. But for now, no. I guess you could, if we were using LLVM as the backend, you could presume that you could compile C through that. I don't know. For now, my focus is on making the new language and not worrying about C so much. Given that the language intentionally has unsaved constructs, do you think that it would be better to write libraries in something like Rust? Not really. The thing about libraries is libraries are what you often need to be fast. Like my graphics library needs to be fast. My audio mixer should be fast, or I'm wasting a lot of time, right? Fast, Rust claims that they're fast. I think that remains to be seen for the type of programming that we do when we're serious. Maybe it is still. I don't know. It's we have to see how Rust evolves and how their optimizer comes out and all that good stuff. But so that's one thing, is there would just be that concern. But the other thing is friction matters for libraries as much as it matters for game code, and I don't like the friction that happens with Rust. For me, I do think that the safety in Rust is a really good, like every frickin' time a new Unix command line utility has an overflow bug in it, which is like every day new ones are found that were 30 years old, it starts to seem like a good idea to have that extreme degree of memory safety that Rust has. So I don't, I don't condemn it or anything, but it's not personally what I want to use to program, and I already am pushing myself to the limit, and I'm barely getting done what I'm getting done these days. So to add more friction to that just feels onerous to me. I want something with less friction, not more friction, which is why I'm doing all this stuff with like for loops and enums and stuff. It's to decrease friction. Am I going to have multiple return values or something like Rust's destructuring? We'll do something like that. I don't know which. I'm not sure. Someone else is bike chatting about syntax. Sorry, it took me a long time to read those messages. What is the syntax for explicitly named iterator? Seems as though the P example exposed only the plain object. Okay. Oh, yeah. Sorry. This might not be too obvious for people who are steeped in C++ culture. There is no iterator object in these for loops. There's no like high-level weird thing that calls functions to do what it's doing. There's just an integer. There's an integer behind the scenes. And actually, it's not even behind the scenes anymore because you can call it index. So that index is the actual iterator. Like it's an integer that gets incremented every time through the loop. And then when you use the data value there, that's just happens through one expression that automatically indexes through the array using that index. So it's as simple as you can make it. It's not this bizarre C++ iterator horrible thing. I hate iterators in C++. They drive me nuts. Oh, leaving a single member uninitialized, I meant what about for a single instance of a vector 3, like myvec equals vector 3 with x equals dash 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 at the declaration site. The language doesn't have syntax for that right now because it doesn't have syntax for explicit struct initializations like that, right? So like, in C or C++ now, you could say, well, this is in C. I'm going to say v equals, well, you could say vector 3 v equals 1, 2, 3, right? You could say that in C, I think now, and compilers will handle it. Let's see, good luck. I was fighting with this syntax yesterday, so it doesn't work in certain cases where you would expect it to work. But usually that probably works. So the equivalent of that in this language would be something like, v vector 3 equals that. And if we supported that yet, you could do that. But we don't support this part yet. It's just not in the language. Now the thing is, the concept of an array literal is in the language because that's how I implemented these arrays in the enums. Like when I say hello.names and hello.values, to the compiler front end, those are just like those array literals in curly braces, but they didn't come through the program text. So there's not yet a syntax for saying them in the program text. That syntax, or the rest of the front end handles it. It had to in order to generate this code, but there's just no way to type it in yet. So once there's a way to type it in, you'll probably be able to do that. But I haven't seen that as a high priority feature yet. So someone is wondering how you resolve this if developers have mistakenly put inline and no inline in their build. Well, I will show you. So let's say, so test G is really up here. It says inline. So what if I put a no inline test G there? That should conflict. And it does. It says contradictory inlining, yes and no, right? So that's an error. You must, fix one of those elements. Right now, this error message isn't maximally helpful because it doesn't tell you the lines of the actual directives. It just tells you the line of the function. But as we improve error message, it would tell you, the first directive is here and the second directive is there. Let me fix that so it'll compile. You should be able to inline in the C interpreter just by duplicating the code, right? But wouldn't be able to honor no inline. Yeah, I mean, you could sort of do it, but not 100% really. And I don't think the C backend is long for this world. Like, it's annoying enough to have to make stuff work in C all the time, and it slows me down enough that I may actually just skip to LLVM sooner than I thought. We'll see how that goes. Someone is saying, earlier I said I could define types with specific default values, like the vector with 139. If someone has not looked at the definition, they may assume it was all 0. Yes, they might, but that's called knowing what your program does and what your objects are, right? Like if you're going to use a vector, you should know how it behaves, probably. If you don't know, I mean, it's stupid to make a vector that's initialized to 1, 4, and 9, right? So that was just an example so that we're not staring at all zeros all day. But let me get rid of oh, I did. Okay. Yeah, I don't see that as a problem. That's more like programming correctly. What happens with nested loops iterating over the same array when you remove an element? They do not know about each other, so you can have a problem. It's exactly the same problem you would have if you were iterating with for loops manually. So that is actually a very hard problem to solve if you don't want to get into Rust land, which I don't. So just like you would have to be aware of it without a higher level for loop construct like this, you also need to be aware of it here. It's exactly the same problem. Removing an element from a flat array can be an expensive operation. No, it's not. That's why it's an unordered remove. We're just removing one element and replacing it with the end element. It's very fast. Oh, and that's what you're saying. Yes, that's what I am doing. That is why the elements of the array came out unordered. Sorry for asking this, but how are the structs laid out in the bytecode? Right now, they're basically the same way as C, where the way that you declare them in the struct is the order in which they appear in the bytecode. With some padding. I think my padding is 8 bytes right now by default, which can be quite big in some cases, and I don't actually bother to pack smaller types together yet. I'll do that later. It's not super important. What is more important, I think, is to give people good control over the packing of a struct. And I don't mean like pragma pack or stuff like that, because that's weird. And it doesn't give you real control. I mean something like saying X is 0 bytes in and Y is 8 bytes in and whatever. And if they overlap, they overlap. Probably. I mean, you need some way to make that not error prone too, but that'll come first, and then smart automatic packing of members will come after that. Someone's asking if a for loop could move each subsequent element into place as I visit it. I would rather not complexify the for loop because when I say remove, I want that action to be very simple. Okay, so the question is sort of talking about mitigating the cost of doing an ordered remove. right? If you remove the element and say I want to do an ordered remove and shuffle all the other elements down, if you delay when those elements get shuffled, you could mitigate the cost of copying them down, right? Because you might remove, several of them, and then you only need to do the copy for each element once in that case. The problem is that some other part of your code may need to look at that array and expect it to be well formed, and now it's got weird stuff in it where the holes are. So I don't want to do that, right? Remove is not, this goes back to what I was talking about in the beginning about like an 80% language where the facilities are very simple and very predictable and have no surprises, but they also don't try to do 100% of what you might. So yes, you might want a fast ordered remove of an array, and if you want that, then you're right now outside of the bounds of what the for loop in this language will do, and that's probably will always be true. Because I want, if it's a language primitive, it is very simple, it is very easy to predict, and it's not going to put latent surprises into your program. All right. Oh, Tyler says by ordered, I don't mean sorted. You mean they remain in the order you add them to the array. Well, the comments that I've said to those other questions are still relevant. It's like, unless you make it a very slow ordered remove, which is easy to add, and which I wouldn't mind adding, like that wouldn't be the worst thing. A slow ordered remove would be fine, but some kind of thing that pulls shenanigans to defer when things move, I don't think is okay. That's like not a language primitive, because you might go do 500 milliseconds of computation before you come back and get to the next element of the array, and who knows what that's doing, right? So let's not presume. Scrolling down. Will you be able to leverage LLVM's optimization, or is that something you'll have to do yourself? I'm hoping we can use LLVM, and that'll be just fine. I have yet to look at LLVM, but people tell me it's not so bad. So, certainly the LLVM developers seem like they're really smart. So I'm all for that if it can be made to work. Am I going to do named optional parameters to functions? Yes, that'll happen eventually. Any thoughts about accessibility, namespaces, etc.? I started to do namespaces. They'll come later. They're just not that important compared to these other things. People act like they're really important. They sort of are because they prevent you from having to do ugly name prefixing things, but honestly, they're a little less important than some of these other language issues. So I'm doing namespaces as I feel the necessity. I think you'll see a lot more about them next time. Public and private, I don't really give a rat's ass about private. I don't personally use it. I think all those people who tell you private is very important are the same people who tell you all sorts of other terrible things are very important, like RAII and like object-oriented world modeling and stuff. And I know there's an argument that private becomes more and more important as your team gets bigger and stuff, and maybe that's true, but I don't regard it as a super important language feature. And if it were to become an important language feature, it would have to be rethought, and it would have to work a little bit better than it does. Like, I think saying a variable is read-only is a lot more useful than saying it's private, for example. But there's no read-only in C or C++, I don't think, unless they recently added one. Will you be able to use loops with user-defined container types? Seems like you'd need some kind of iterator-like construct for that. Probably, assuming that we have that kind of model, which is unclear to me because I haven't done it yet. But assuming we have that kind of model where you'd say, here's my generic container that happens to be a hash table and you can iterate over it, then yeah, for loops will probably have a way of handling that. That'll hopefully be like a much cleaner version of C++'s. I haven't looked at what D does, but theirs is probably better than C++'s, right? Yeah. But I like iterating with for, and I would use that for a higher level type if it didn't cause other linguistic problems by doing so. Someone says you could always give trigraphs a middle finger. We're not going to have trigraphs. So what's going to happen is the compiler will be UTF-8 clean, and if you just want to type in whatever you want in your native language that uses whatever funny characters, that'll just work. Some other languages have done that lately, so I think Swift, for example, works that way, and it's just what you should do. I haven't really focused on that yet because Emacs is annoying when it comes to UTF-8. So I'm going to have to write my own editor first, but yeah, sooner or later, it'll just be that you type in UTF-8 and everything's fine. Do you consider doing array bounds checking in debug builds? Yes, that's one of the reasons why I want to have that array specifier instead of just a pointer, right? Because the compiler knows the length, it can insert those checks automatically. And I said all that in the first couple talks, actually. So you might go check those and see what other stuff I said that is not yet implemented. Would I be considering any sort of lexical scope operator that behaves like ... / to access iterator literals from enclosing scope in nested loops? You already can access iterator literals from enclosing scope if they're not shadowed, like in this ij loop that I did. Where was that? Down here, right? I'm using I and j from this inner loop, right? Like that you can do. The thing you can't do is if you called them both I or you called them both it, then you can't refer to the outer one. And I could add some syntax for that, but I don't think I would add that just for that problem. I would say, like, dude, just don't be weird, right? That said, because I haven't done a full namespace implementation yet, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, like, what should the syntax for that stuff be? And directory syntax is not the worst thing because it lets you navigate around like that, which you might want to do sometimes. And it's a very familiar syntax. So instead of saying, where's our hello stuff? Instead of saying hello.names, you might say hello names, right? Well, that means you can't use slash as a division operator anymore. And people might freak out about that, but when you get really deep in a hierarchy, if it looks a lot like directory names, there might be a certain comfort to that. So I haven't ruled that out, but it's a little bit weird, but it might be fine. And then if you did that, you might as well do ... Am I considering adding multidimensional arrays in as a basic type? The parser handles multidimensional arrays, but the middle, like the type inference and code generation, don't yet, just because all this stuff is really complicated and I just wanted to get it working, right? So at some point, provided that everything else goes well, I'll probably turn multidimensional arrays back on. Because I think that they're good to have sometimes. They're not super important, though. And the question is, like, what happens, like, do you need to say that it's a two-dimensional array? Or do you just say that and multidimensional arrays get flattened? I think this probably happens, but I don't know, right? You can go crazy and do slice stuff like Go does or whatever. I don't know if I like slices. I'm kind of not convinced by the whole slice thing. Because I think in a data-oriented language, you don't necessarily want to do that. We'll talk about that more next time. Would I implement strings as first-class types? Could they be constant? Well, okay, so I do think it's important to have good strings. I want to implement them well. I don't know what to do for them yet. Right now, they're just a pointer, right? So right now, you could say string, but behind the scenes, that's just a pointer to a U8 with no length, right? I should at least change it so that it's an unknown length array of U8, right? That would be better. And that might be the standard string definition, because then to ask the length of the string in bytes at least, you wouldn't have to call a function that's slow. You just ask for the count on that array, right? So that's already a little better than C, and as Walter Bright says in his essay, it will help solve a lot of bugs that C tends to have. However, I don't know. I feel like there might be some other nuances about strings. Again, like I was saying with the array removal, I want whatever the typical or built-in string to be. I want whatever the built-in string is, it should have certain properties, like it's very fast, and what it does is very simple and very well understood, so that people want to use it everywhere, and so that there's no performance penalty to using it everywhere, right? So it's not going to be like std string in C++, where, if you I tweeted just the other day, someone actually decided to profile Chrome, and every keystroke in the address box in Chrome does 25,000 allocations and deallocations, which is insane for one key. Should be 0 allocations for one keystroke. But there you have it. That's what happens when you use std string all over the place and you aren't careful about it. If you have to be really careful about it, then it's taking a lot of mental energy to be Sorry, my mic got a little bit unplugged. That's why the chat was going fast. All right, what was I saying when we lost sound? What was I saying when we lost sound? Tell me. I wish the latency on Twitch were lower. Okay, just finished talking about strings. I think, so someone asked about structive arrays, and yes, I'll have some things to say about SOA next time. Oh, and about string comparison, actually, to finish up the string question. Double equals should probably compare the contents of a string, and in fact, they probably should compare the contents of an array or a struct, even if those things are slow, right? Like if you have an array of 50 floats and you say, is that equal to another array of 50 floats? It probably should do that comparison. It probably shouldn't be like C and treat them as a pointer and say, oh, they're different pointers. Just for simplicity. And then you should know that that's a slow operation if you're doing something crazy there. But you also, you should be able to use equals to compare two strings, even if they're not the same pointer, and just know that they're equal. Like, I presume, again, I haven't used a language that does that because I've used C and C++ for 20 years or more. So maybe I would find a downside to that, but probably, every time we simplify some things in the core language, we buy ourselves some more complexity that then we can use for further up the expression chain, right? Or just don't add new complexity, right? And make the programmer's life simple and more joyful. So like the whole thing in C, we're used to it now that like, oh, you just can't compare strings like that. But like, who said, right? Okay. Oh, someone was saying, do I have any thoughts about partial class or struct like C#? I don't know C#, so I can't answer that. When will I have documentation on my type system? When there is a type system. So you can take the time to properly critique it? Like what? Go away. In lieu of having public and private, which I also hate, are you considering having properties where you define a getSet function and can access them like a variable? I've thought about, so I don't like getter and setter in the classic sense of where object orientation people would say, oh, you shouldn't expose your variable, like people should have to always access them through getters and setters. I think that's dumb. However, there may be, if you're starting to do a lot of metaprogramming and stuff, there may be a lot of value in being able to place getters and setters on things. However, it could also get crazy, right? Because you could turn your program into something where you have no idea what the variable accesses do. Like you read a value, you think you're just reading an integer, and you're actually sending a probe to the moon and back, right? That happens in C++ with operator overloading, so you want to avoid that. Maybe though, if you had a setting in your IDE where like you have a set of buttons across the top to change your syntax highlighting to visualize your program in different ways, maybe one of those ways would be like which one of these things is invoking an overloaded operator, like that shows up in bright red, and then maybe it would be easier to spot again. I don't know, so things change over time. It's not something I've ruled out, getters and setters. It's not something I've ruled in. It's an idea that's kind of floating in space. I think there are more important things to do more fundamentally, like basic introspection and some kind of model of how you do object-y things that is not the C++ model. But once those get nailed down, then these other things may come along. Okay, so now everyone's complaining about when the mic cut out. Scrolling through that. People are talking about the Chrome 25,000 allocations per keystroke. It's completely insane. Yeah, read the article. They're just using std string all over the place in Chrome, and you end up converting between std string and a char star, depending on who you're talking to, and you convert back and forth and back and forth, and before you know it, things are completely insane, right? What do I think of the D programming language? I don't know D very well. It seems like a much better C++. If my choice was between C++ and D, I would switch to D immediately, right? Because it appears to be a lot better in every way. But again, I have some different ideas of how to program. Like D, D tries to give you a lot of latitude for how you program, but I think in games especially, over the last couple years, we've come to some conclusions about how we want to program in a very data-oriented way, especially as cache misses have become more and more expensive. And I think you want a language that is conscientiously data-oriented, which I don't really think D is. And again, that may become more and more apparent as I go further on and start adding some of these other features and restructuring the language around data orientation. When I'm ready for initial release, am I planning on trying a Snowdrift co-op funding model? No, the initial release of this language will not be tied to money in any way. You'll be able to download the source code for free and build it. Yeah, I told you to go away. The whole like, can I properly critique your type system is like, it just seems a little snooty. I mean, maybe, there are lots of people in academia, for example, who know a lot about type systems and who certainly know a lot more than me about type systems, right? However, I find the attitude that's prevalent in academia among people who know a lot about type systems is that it's a very, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail attitude, where like the type system will solve everything, right? Just make your type system more intrusive and make it specify more things, and then your language will be the most amazing language in the world. I don't think that's true. That's never true about anything in the past, or hasn't been in the past. So I don't think it's true about type systems either, right? So what I want to do is I want to start with something like C, and then build up a very useful type system that that again introduces the minimal number of surprises, that is not encumbering to specify things with, and that doesn't cause slow compile times and things like that. Compile times are very, very important. And once I've got something like that, then we'll take a look at, do we need something more expressive, and or are there weird ambiguities in this type system that would be better to clean up with something more formal? But I don't even care about how formal it is initially. I want it to do the job. And the moment of clarity that caused me to sit down and typing this compiler was that throughout the game industry, and probably some related industries, we have a very clear idea now of what the job is that we want to do. It's much clearer than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And as that idea has gotten clearer, it's gotten further and further away from what other programming languages help us do. I want to do things that help us do that job. So the type system is going to be designed to be as simple as possible and to help us do the job that we want to do, right? Which type systems from academia, I don't know if the questioner is from academia, but type systems like that tend to be self-serving. I don't want language features to be self-serving. I want them to be in the name of getting the thing done quickly and effectively. Have I looked into the Cyclone programming language? I probably glanced at it, but I've glanced at a lot of programming languages, and in the end don't tend to remember them that well. So someone is saying about getters, setters, what if a variable has specific limitations, restrictions about the value it is set to? If you're writing an API, for example, and the person using the API doesn't know the restrictions that have been given to the variable, wouldn't a setter be essential? It depends on the API, maybe, but don't think about it as a setter. Think about, I'm passing this parameter to the API that's going to validate it, right? That's what you do with a function, usually, right? And so the further and further you get away from functions, by adding weird new kinds of functions that are just like functions, but that don't do anything different except a little thing, that actually makes your system more confusing. And I don't want to do that unless we buy something really big with it. So that's just to say that I don't want to be in the business of adding so-called high-level things that don't really get a lot done. So if that were the only use of a setter, is to validate parameters, I would say just make your API so that you specify it by calling a function. People are asking me about data orientation stuff. A lot more of that will be answered next time, so I'm not going to go into those questions now. There will be a substantial body of data-oriented talk next time. Someone is telling me that if I make an ad hoc type system, it's not going to be particularly good at encoding constraints, etc. No, it is probably not going to be very good at encoding constraints. I don't think encoding constraints is testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, at least I spotted that one, I think, when it started happening. So I forget where I was in that question, but someone was saying, an ad hoc type system isn't going to be that good about expressing constraints and things like that. And I'm just saying, man, like the job that we're trying to do in the game industry all the time doesn't have very much to do with expressing complex type constraints. It's way more basic than that, which is why I focused on things like, how do you specify a debug build and a release build? Like, you wouldn't believe the amount of effort that we spend both in setting that stuff up and maintaining it, and in weird glitches that go wrong, and in the difficulty of specifying files in IDEs. Like, it's a huge drain, right? That is way more important than like specifying a constraint on a type, I think. Now, once all those problems get solved, and we're not just tripping over ourselves all the time doing basic stuff, then maybe we'll decide that type constraints are important, and then we'll rev the language maybe or something and give it a real type system. But for now, I don't think that that's very important. And that's what I was saying about academia's attitude toward type system versus mine. I think there's so many things that I care about more in terms of just feeling good about programming from day to day and getting my job done. Like, as soon as you're specifying constraints with your type system, you're also introducing a lot of typing, like manual typing on keys, that may be inconvenient as well. So I'm not necessarily thrilled about it. Okay. I haven't done stuff about parallel programming yet. That's for later. In general, if I haven't demoed something, you probably don't need to ask about it because I haven't done it yet, right? It's a compiler in progress. So if I see a lot of these questions, it makes the Q&A boring later for people to watch me and see me say, oh, that's not done yet. Oh, that's not done yet. So I'm going to skip questions about classes of features that are not done yet. So parallel programming is that class of feature. I don't know. Things like that. I think that's all the questions. Any last one or two questions? I would like to be done. It's been a couple hours now. We can all go over to Handmade Hero. Tyler's up on the questions today. Am I planning on having a way to build new containers that fit? Yeah, I mean, probably. That's what I said about the for loop before. We just have to see. Like, first we need a type system. Like, you can't even put a method on a struct right now or associate a function with a struct. So that's the minimum of what you need before you can do that for loop kind of stuff. So when we get there, when the language has enough other expressivity, then we'll look at that. How would iteration of structs work? I haven't worked it out, but you could think of making the type of a struct be a first class thing that you can get with some language primitive like type of or something. And then that type could be a struct itself that's like metadata about the other struct, right? So just like we had metadata on the enum, of the number of elements and the names and the values, right? Just like we had that metadata, we could have that metadata about a struct itself in another struct. So lacking any other idea of how to do it, that is probably how I would do it. But I haven't sat down to do it yet, so it's not clear. Yeah. So if you're going to iterate over a struct, the fields can have different types, so you need some way of specifying the type of each field. And that itself would probably be some other struct. Like there would probably be a struct that could describe to you the type of anything in the language, right? And it might have pointers to other structs of its own type to describe anything arbitrarily complicated. And I know what that could look like because that's what you end up having to type when you're building an abstract syntax tree for a compiler, right? So it could look a lot like the abstract syntax tree of your structure, in which case you might as well go whole hog and then just tell you the whole abstract syntax tree of the whole program, maybe, right? And then you could like iterate over your function and look at all the things that are being done in your function, maybe. It remains to be seen, right? And then maybe if you do that, I can let you modify the function at compile time before it gets compiled. We'll see. We'll see how far that rabbit hole goes. Someone is saying, can you assign a variable of type unknown int to be a 5 static array and then change it to a 10 static array? In other words, do something bad. Yes, right now you can do that. And well, you can't change it back to a 10 wide static array because there's no way to cast in that direction, I don't think, right now. You could change the count on the unknown length array to be 10, in which case you have just done something that's probably going to confuse your program and cause it to crash. I don't try to prevent that right now. There's probably no real good reason. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. There might be plenty of good reasons why you might want to do that kind of operation, so I don't want to prohibit it, right? Hopefully it doesn't become a center of where people make a lot of mistakes. It doesn't sound to me like it would be a very common mistake, but we'll see, right? We're experimenting. The standard library, yes, would include drawing things on the screen and getting input from the keyboard. Those things are very important. Every program wants to do them. I don't think you should have to talk to some non-standard weird third-party library to do that stuff. All right, I'm going to go. I'm going to save my voice. Thank you, everybody, for coming by. I'm going to go watch Handmade Hero, which I'm about to turn on the hosting for any second now. I'm going to, meanwhile, work pretty hard on compiler features over Christmas break, and we'll see what I come back with next month. Hopefully some kind of object model-y thing, hopefully some kind of SOA thing. We'll see. Thanks for the time, and I'll see you guys later on.